Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Steve Almond. I will tell you all about Steve in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership perspective, you do it for common cause to bring people together to achieve positive aims. My guest today is Steve Almond. Welcome, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. I want to tell everybody about you. You are the author of 11 books of fiction and nonfiction, including New York Times bestsellers, Candyfreak and Against Football. Your essays and reviews have been published virtually everywhere, New York Times Magazine, Poets and Writers, and your short stories have been in the Best American Short Stories and many other places. You did a podcast with Cheryl Strayed for 4 years. You now teach creative writing at the Neiman Foundation at Harvard and at Wesleyan. Steve Almond, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Yes, good to be with you. That's all true. All those things you said are true.
Good. Well, it is nonfiction. So anyway, the reason you're here is because I have fallen in love with this book. Truth is the arrow. Mercy is the bow. It is a book about how to write better. And so for that reason, many of my audience are executive coaches who write and HR professionals who do that. We're all involved with storytelling, and that's what you excel in, Steve. So storytelling is how we share ourselves with others. You help writers do that, and coaches do the same. You're an eloquent writer, and I'd like you to read a passage from your book. It's on page 157, if you would do that for us, please, Steve. So.
Yeah. The most fundamental question for readers is to who we're being asked to care about, what they desire, and what sort of trouble they encounter in pursuit of that desire. In other words, what promises is the peacemaking? Has our protagonist been forced to reckon with external obstacles and internal conflicts?
Well, that could be a definition of what we coaches do. We wrestle with, sometimes we feel like we're wrestling, individuals who are wrestling with questions, their purpose, where do they go? And so when you are a prolific, not only prolific writer, but you teach. So give us an insight into how you get writers to express their inner selves. Any tricks of the trade, or are there tricks?
Well, I think I would say that to get people to really engage in storytelling requires them to sort of turn down the "do you like me" button, the sort of ego need that we have, because that causes me anyway, and I know a lot of the writers who I've worked with, they sort of stand in between the audience and the story, kind of performing with the language in certain ways. And that's very different than storytelling. Storytelling is usually just being as simple and direct as you can about things that matter deeply to you, whether that's experiences or events or sort of insights that you've garnered over the years. Whatever it is you're writing about, your job is really to be as simple and direct as you can about things that matter to you deeply. That's what the reader is interested in, ultimately, the audience. And so the central thing I tell people is stop performing and let the story, focus on telling the story.
It's sound advice. So why don't writers do it? Because they want to be heard, they want to be seen, maybe a little show off. So what's holding them back, Steve? What do you discover?
I think it's insecurity and ego need, which are totally understandable. When you're writing something, it's probably true of any creative endeavor. You got two voices inside your head. I'm sure a lot of people who are coaches, for instance, have these two voices. The one that says, basically, you're terrific, you're an inspiration, you're absolutely going to kill this, you're going to help people, you're going to be in service of their actualization, ... And there's another voice inside of us that says just the opposite. Oh, this is not going to work. You don't really have the goods. They're going to find you out. You're an imposter. It's all going to end in failure. And those two feelings, I think, accompany any creative endeavor. And your job isn't really to make them go away. It's to try to manage the fluctuation between those two feeling states. And that's hard to do. But what I tend to recommend that people do is try to turn down their expectations that they put on themselves, to recognize to be sort of curious and humble rather than, I think, what we can fall into, which is sort of entitled, aggrieved, self-doubting, and insecure. And insecurity acts on the creative impulse like hydrochloric acid acts on the skin. It's just totally corrosive. It's understandable, but it doesn't serve the work.
Right. Well, you touched on something that many of us coaches may feel, especially as authors, but also that we see in our in those we coach, and that is the imposter syndrome. So I don't belong here. So what advice do you give to your authors about getting through that self-doubt, Steve?
Well, I think it's the way I say it is, you just have to outlast your doubt. You can't make it go away. You can't just tell it to be quiet and sit in the corner. It's there, it's real. And what I tend to tell people is to sort of lower their expectations, set the bar lower. If they're feeling self-doubt, like for years, I told myself the story, I'm meant to write the great American novel. I'm meant to write a great novel. And for years, I fell short of that, 30 years. And that was the story that I had in my head. Oh, well, he's a failed novelist. He's a failed. It doesn't matter how many books he writes, how much stuff he publishes, where he teaches. He's really at the heart of it, a failed novelist. Well, the reason that I was finally able to write a novel, as counterintuitive as it might seem, a novel that was worth publishing, is because I gave up. I just stopped one day. I said, why am I defining myself by something I can't do? That seems like a very self-punishing arrangement. And I just gave up. And that, I believe, sort of opened up a creative space inside of me into which the muse was able to walk, a character who I loved so much that I wanted to follow her through a whole novel. It wasn't me trying to write a novel. It was me attached to a character and trying to see what kind of danger she was going to get into and whether she could get herself out of it.
And now, listeners need to know that while you didn't do that novel for 30 years, you are a prolific short story writer. And so, that's fiction. So, that doubt was, you said, oh, it's not good enough. So, because I think many of us feel that at times. Writing a short story is quite an accomplishment. So,
well, the relationship, actually, my relationship to failure is even more direct, John. So the pattern in my career, such as I can find one, is Almond tries to write a novel for a couple of years. It's a failure. He's confronted by that failure. The real world apprises him of his failure. He falls into some manner of a depression or a slump, and he takes on an easier writing project that's usually something that he's deeply obsessed with anyway, like the book about football, the book about candy, or I wrote a book about my favorite novel and what it means to me. In other words, what I did was I would fail at one thing, but then I would set the bar more realistically. I stopped asking, what should I be writing, and started asking a much more useful question, which is, what do I want to write? What do I feel capable of writing? What kind of book in this moment in my life? So that, I think, actually failure is your ally. It's not the thing you're sort of trying to avoid. It's the thing you're trying to learn from.
Absolutely. That is a watchword in coaching. Failure is a teacher, and how can you learn from it? Now, where the title of your book is that truth is the arrow, mercy is the bow. Where did that come from, Steve? So.
Well, it came from my head. I was trying.
Great.
It's not a quote. It's something that was me refining what I've been trying to say to students, especially students of writing who are really inhibited about telling the full truth. There's something holding them back, and usually that thing is guilt and anxiety about what people will think. Maybe it's not going to be good enough, but probably if the story's any good, it's going to wake up some ghosts. It's going to break some silences. And there's a lot of anxiety that attends that. And you can't make that anxiety go away, but you can remind yourself that your goal is to go back into those painful rooms and to forgive everybody, and actually to try to understand why they had to behave in the ways that they did. That's the mercy part. And you will travel just as far into truth as your mercy will get you, and no further.
Okay. Now, it is said that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But if I perceive it, you've played with the form so that the concept is there's a beginning and an end, yes, but a whole bunch of middles. And I thought, well, that's a lot like life, is it not, Steve?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you can sort of trace birth and death, or, sort of early infancy and the decline into death. Those are pretty easy to spot. But I think most people, the middle of most people's lives, which is when they're engaged with the project of trying to understand what they're meant to do with their brief, precious span on Earth, that is, I wouldn't say it's just a lot of middles, it's a lot of muddles. Like, people are always kind of uncertain. They're uncertain what goals they should set. They're uncertain whether they can attain them. And I think, like failure, doubt is not something that we should run and try to hide from. We shouldn't retreat into some false sense of assurance. What we should do is say, okay, part of the time that we're in living, we're kind of lost in some way. And I write about this in Truth is the Arrow, because to me, those periods which we tend to hide from view when we feel really lost, we've wandered off the path, we're feeling down on ourselves, getting into bad relationships or relationships with drugs or whatever it is, the periods that we tend to hide from, those are oftentimes periods of incredible growth. It's just, there's a lot of turmoil as well. And part of what we're doing in that time is sort of our internal life is trying to struggle to figure out what the next beat of our life is supposed to be.
We get the truth part. That's what we're all striving. But I think in our culture, and perhaps you agree, that there's far too little mercy. So in your title, are you implying writers need to show themselves mercy, or for their characters as well?
Everybody in the room. So you're in the room and your characters are in the room. And there's a relationship there. You have to be able to, in order to be forgiving of somebody, say you're writing a memoir and it has to do with a parent who was very difficult, maybe, verbally abusive, maybe worse than that, somebody who really undermined you. It really takes a lot of work to be able to say, you know what, I know that person wasn't born trying to be a bad parent or bully me or undermine me. Something in them distorted their love into destructive behavior. I wonder what that thing is. And I think that attitude of curiosity about why people behave the way they do, it's a sense of detachment from our own personal grievances, is the way that we're able to kind of access the more merciful parts of ourselves. And we have to extend that to ourselves. And then I think it travels outward.
Cool. Great. Now, truthful writing, or writing in general, is hard. It's hard work, especially if you're perhaps a memoir or deep into a novel, or you're getting into self-truth. So what have you learned about the process from teaching this, and striving for the self-truth?
Yeah, I think teaching is a place where you get to try to put language to the things that keep people from what sounds very simple. They'll just, write simply and directly about the things that matter to you most deeply, whether it's in fictional disguise or, for whether it's for a narrative you're writing for a grant, whatever the story is you're telling. It sounds very easy to say, well, just write simply and directly about the stuff that matters to you, the most deeply. But it turns out that people are really conflicted about pursuing the truth, because it can lead in painful directions and there's a lot of exposure involved. And as a teacher, what I'm trying to do for the most part is to make students feel that they have the right to at least try, that they should give it a try before they put too much pressure on themselves. And I think what I've learned is that most people naturally, given the opportunity, if they can get disinhibited, are in fact incredible storytellers. When Cheryl Strayed and I were hosting the Dear Sugars podcast, we would get letters from people. They weren't professional writers, John. They were just people who were in some sort of personal struggle. And they would write these deeply honest, because they knew it was just going to two empathic people. They'd write these letters, were so beautifully written, because beauty, it turns out, is really just the residue of our pursuit of truth. And they had found a place within themselves where they just wanted to tell somebody the truth. And the prose was absolutely astonishing. I'm convinced that everybody is capable of that kind of beautiful writing, as long as they're merciful enough to be truthful about what they're living through.
Great. Well, the topic of, we strive for, certainly in management, we want clarity. Managers and leaders are their job is to set clear expectations and support the endeavor when they can. But there's always that doubt. and there's a parallel I have heard you write this, but also novelists, is to create the characters and let the characters go. So how does that work in fiction? Are you living in an imaginary world, or what? How does that happen, Steve? So,
well, I think it's an incremental process, and the way that fiction writers tend to work, they sort of have two parts of their brains. One part is just sort of saying what if over and over again, imagining characters into existence. Oftentimes those characters are based on people who we know or parts of ourselves, but they imagine a character into existence and then they sort of put them through their paces, and they're sort of wandering around for a while trying to figure out what the story is. And at a certain point, if the story's any good, the character has some deep fear, some deep desire, maybe a deep desire that's cleaved to a danger or a fear, and the plot sets them in pursuit of that. That's how story is generated, in my view, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. In nonfiction, you're trying to identify those desires and fears, but in fiction, you're making them up, or you're borrowing them from your subconscious and reapportioning them to fictional characters.
right. Now, you told a very touching story about you and Cheryl Strayed doing the podcast and receiving eloquent letters from
Yeah.
people just being honest. So you teach writing and have been doing it for quite some time. You're very accomplished. That's why you're at the Neiman Fellowship program. What if students taught you about writing? So,
Well, the most interesting thing about the Neimans is that half of them are foreign-born journalists. So they're writing English as a second or third or fourth language. And they always come in, John, and they say, I don't know if I want to try to write complicated essays, more personal stuff, and to try to do that in English. I don't think so. My English isn't good enough. And invariably, I say to them, don't worry about it. I promise you, your English is good enough. And in fact, you're going to write more interesting prose than most of the people for whom English is a first language. And that happens every single semester. That there's something about the particular struggle to find the right word, even in a different language, a second or third language, and the way that they come at the language, the way that they shape sentences, the grammar that's in their heads is different from English. It's more exciting, it's novel. And so when they produce stories, almost always they're charged with a certain kind of novelty, a newness that those of us who grew up speaking and writing in English just don't have. So that's one thing that's really instructive, that coming in a certain way as a stranger in a strange land makes you more powerful as a storyteller.
We had talked previously about your work at the Neiman Foundation, and you were working with journalists and the different aspects. Many of the listeners on this show are writers themselves or are telling their own story. So, what are some tips or techniques for not expressive nonfiction writing? So, how can we do it better? So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like the book is attempting to, rather than say sort of here are the tricks of the trade, is the middle panel of it, the 5 essays that come after the stuff about craft are really saying, where does story come from, right? And what I would recommend that people do is try to connect to those sources of inspiration. I believe stories come from our obsessions, right? Our obsessive desires, our obsessive fears. They come from our impulses, our drives. They come from our doubt. They come from the parts of our desire that go unrequited and therefore kind of are consecrated in that way in our mind, from our crushes, in other words, our high school or junior high school crushes. That's where story comes from. And your job as a writer, in a sense, is to try to plug into those sources of creativity, the stories that are lodged in you. One of the things that people will say to me is, what should I write about? And I always say the same thing. I say, you write about what you can't get rid of by other means. That's how it works.
In your book, you write about humor. And I think all of us, and many of us in the audience, are public speakers, and we all want to engage with our audience. And the topic of humor is there. Should I use it or not use it? Same with our manager. Should I be funny or not be funny? And very often the answer is no. But so humor has to be organic to the situation, does it not, Steve? So
I think it's not just organic to the situation. I think it's organic to the person who is, delivering the talk or, having to run the meeting, whatever it is. In other words, your job is to get the full range of your personality into the room. And part of how we've adapted to the difficulties and struggle and disappointment and whatever else in our lives is by finding a way to be a little more forgiving of those tough moments. And that's really what a sense of humor is. It's a little moment of forgiveness where you step back from a tragic feeling state or an upsetting feeling state, and you are able to kind of poke fun at yourself a little bit and at the situation that you were in. And I think we do that all the time, just as a matter of trying to navigate adolescence and our relationships. And if you're a parent, the sort of what comes up with your kids, those moments where we can step back from a situation that in other contexts we're stressed about, we're anxious about, we're angry about, we're frustrated, and sort of say, my God, is it hard to be a parent? God, my kid did the craziest thing. And that little moment of self-forgiveness is the point of humor. It's not to entertain people. It's to get to the truth a little more quickly. And sometimes you need a kind of a shield in a way to get to that dark part of your experience. And that's what a sense of humor is. It's the ability to make a joke that is funny because it's really quick to the truth and the audience recognizes that.
One of the powers of this book is that it has elements of a memoir in it. And there are times when you call yourself out on the carpet. But one story resonated with me. I think maybe it was early in your career as a teacher. And I don't know if it was a freshman composition class or something, but there was a gifted student and she was too showy or something in her prose. And you two did not connect. And then later on, you reflected. So that has some parallel with us as coaches. So tell us that story, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great example. This was a woman, she was, I don't know, I think she was a freshman. She was a, underclassman at Boston College where I taught for years. And she came into the class thinking that she was a really great writer and that everybody would be very impressed by her story. And her story was clever, but she happened to be paired on that workshop day with a classmate who had written an obviously autobiographical story about her first intimate experience with a kind of a predatory older guy. And it was an absolutely gripping, sad, upsetting, at times quite beautiful story that the other student had written. And the energy in the room really shifted because it was one person really showing us, bringing us inside the room in these really wrenching moments of her life. And then you had this student who was really trying to entertain us and was sort of interested in people admiring her metaphors and her wacky subplots. And I think she really felt that she had fallen short somehow, that she had not been the star of that day. And things really turned for her. She got very turned off from the class. And I, as a teacher, didn't know how to address what I needed to, which was to try to give her some reassurance and say, hey, we're all finding our way here. We're all Saul on the way to Damascus. Nobody's got it figured out. And your story's really good. And your next story is probably going to be even better. But I needed to give her a pep talk, which I just didn't do. And she became sort of alienated. And she wound up very upset and aggrieved about the class. And for years, I thought about kind of the ways in which I'd failed her and what I would try to do differently if I had the opportunity to teach her again.
That's a great story, and it's not just for coaches, but for managers too, because we don't always manage the way we would now. And looking back, we're in a learning process too. It's self-learning and digesting. Now, one thing, I'm going to go out on a limb on this book, because you have an essay in here about writing about sex. Yes. Which most of us as coaches don't do publicly or whatever. But there's this thing about revealing oneself or creating this self-awareness that you push the writers to focus on. So what has that, what lessons are there in that, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, basically, obviously in a workplace, in a professional setting, there are certain things that are not appropriate. In the creative writing world, if you're, writing about a set of characters, ostensibly you should write about anything, any situation they're in where they're emotionally vulnerable, where it's dangerous in some way. And the world of sexuality and that kind of relational, encounter is many things. It can be exploited. It can be, it can be exposing and damaging in some ways. It's also, in my experience, terribly vulnerable. Like there's always something interesting happening in our inner lives. May not be articulated in the room. There might be more focus on sort of, what's happening physically, but what's really happening is a lot of thought and feeling. And that's where you want to be. You want to be in those rooms where there's a lot of thought and feeling. So in my view, there's nothing prurient about it. It's a basic part of the human experience. Your characters all, presumably, if they're human beings with libidos, then they have some sort of sexual life. And what's interesting about that is that they're vulnerable in those moments.
Vulnerability is a huge topic in our world, and we're always striving to enable people to show the more human side of them, and however they're comfortable and stuff. So we're coming to the interview end of it, and you have a paragraph on page 183 I'd like you to read that I found very compelling. So.
Yeah. Writers have to find a different way of being in the world. The making of literature is the manner by which we come to understand our inner lives, by which we travel in difficult truth toward elusive mercy, and thereby affirm the bonds of human kindness.
Powerful. And that is what we're all striving for, to be more real, to be kind to one another, all of those things. And so that leads us right into my question, as I ask every guest, a story about grace. Do you have one you'd like to share with us, Steve? So
yeah, I mean, I have kids, so I think a lot about the kind of experiences you have with kids. And a couple of days ago, my son called me, he's 15, called me from some parking lot somewhere. And, he had gotten himself into a bad friend situation and made some not so great decisions. So I went to pick him up. And the entire ride that we had home was a kind of, I think, a sort of sustained moment of grace between us, because I knew that he'd messed up. He knew that he'd messed up. I knew that he didn't need a lecture. He definitely knew he didn't need a lecture. What we had to do, really, or what I tried to do, was just kind of listen, ask him a little bit about what had happened without pushing too much, and try to the extent that it's possible, even though inwardly I'm going, yeah, don't mess this up. Come on, kid. Da, da, da. I had to sort of turn that down and say, what's going on with this kid? Something is in pain here. And it's not my job to make it go away. It's not my job to try to, nail it to the ground and figure out what it is, but just to be with him in it. I think that's kind of what grace is.
That's a beautiful story. And we always talk about showing grace toward others and ourselves, but to our children as well. So I love that story. It's good. Steve, where can people find you? You have a very memorable website. And what is it?
It's just stevealmondjoy.org, not .com or whatever. It's stevealmondjoy.org. And it's just, the name Steve and Almond and Joy all run together, all lowercase, stevealmondjoy.org. And I think most of what I'm up to is there.
Great. Well, the reason you're here is because I love this book. Truth is the arrow, mercy is the bow. Steve, it's been a pleasure to speak to you today, and thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure talking with you, John.